cultures, like girls obviously aren't educated as much. Like, do you think this can be overcome?
So your question was, what's your name?
Simon.
Simon.
Yeah.
Simon asked, in some cultures, girls are not very well educated and they're expected not to. Is that the rough gist of your question?
Yeah, like, can it be overcome? Like,
can it be overcome? To help us think about this question, it's a couple of philosophical ideas that help. Okay. There's one perspective of absolutism that says there is a right way of doing things, and often the person who holds that view says, I'm the one who's got it. Nobody ever believes in absolutism of other people. And then the other view, which never exists by the way, is relativism, the idea that all ways of life are equally valid, or ethical relativism. Nobody ever holds that. You can't. But it's parodied, it's a view that's parodied. But so they're the two extremes. So how can you help think about this issue? To avoid some pitfalls, let me just knock a couple of things out of the way. This question of what do we do about other people's, even I'm falling into that trap, as if women belong and women are owned by certain groups, right? There is a very propertized understanding of women in this context. And there's unfortunately a very dark history of doing two things to non-Western women. One is to make them into objects of sexual desire, for nothing other than, for males' pleasure. And then the other one is to see them as a victim of their own society, that they have no power, they have no control, and they want me to save them. Right? They want me. Right? They're yearning. And if you read the literature of Orientalism, you'll find that there is that there. And then the brown woman goes, oh my God, this is amazing. Our men never treat us like this. I'm so glad I have a white man now. Right? And you read this and you go, what? I've never met such a woman. Because the key to understanding is that women internalize their culture just as men. Okay? And so we don't want to go into this with either a hypersensitivity to colonial history, but also a complete disregard for that colonial history and that very unhelpful way of thinking about other people's women. When we're talking about gender, it's really helpful to think about patriarchy and where it began from. My own thesis is that patriarchy began with the advent of property. Because suddenly you had to defend something, a chunk of land, a bit of wheat, and suddenly men's muscle power, right, became a little bit more important than women, who were before worshipped. So before agricultural revolution, we really worshipped women. I would totally worship women. That's the answer to the heterosexual question. I would happily worship the female form. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. The men form we can do without, just between you and I. Matter of perspective, I suspect. So with the advent of that, men became more important. Then something else really interesting happens, and that is, how do you pass property on? But you realize in every society that doesn't actually have strong succession laws, you find patriarchy. Because you can't control whether, you don't know if you're the father of the baby. So there's this paranoia, this cultural paranoia around her uterus, really. Right? It's about guarding that uterus and making sure it's my son's DNA, my DNA that's being passed on. Because what passes with that DNA is property. And there's this really interesting tension. The better our property rights become and the better our succession laws become, the less need there is of suddenly virginity doesn't become an issue. Female virginity is the equivalent of an inheritance court, right? And it's very unfortunate that women's bodies get tied up. They become sites for contestation. So there's that element to it. The other element, of course, is that if you have no other virtue, no other value than being a vessel for the next generation, you're a means to an end. You're not an end in yourself. And as Immanuel Kant told us, that is the beginning of evil. When you treat human beings as a means to an end and not an end in themselves. So suddenly women become nothing more than a means of passing on the family name. It's the man who's the end, and it's the male child at the other end who's the... So these two variables, the economic and passing off the genes and being a a vessel for the next generation, contribute deep to patriarchy. And the more unstable your property structure, that is to say, if your property isn't land, but rather on four legs that can easily be taken away, that makes it even worse, right? Because if you have property that walks on 4 feet, anybody can take it. How do you protect that? Well, you develop a hyper-masculine culture, where if you mess with a sheep, you're really messing with my honor. Honor is built around the need to protect property that can easily be stolen. And all these variables come together to produce, around the Mediterranean region, hyper-patriarchal societies. So how do you deal with that? Well, you have to realize your own shadow. We have our own patriarchy. Ghassan Haj put it really well. Sometimes I'm a Westerner, sometimes it sounds like this. Hey, Eastern women, hey, let go of your patriarchy, join our patriarchy. Come on, join our patriarchy. It doesn't make sense. 1 in 2 women will be assaulted in Australia by a man that they know. 1 in 3 will have a sexual assault element in there. So 1 in 2 women, that's extraordinary. Have a look around. Women in Australia are subject to that kind of domestic violence. And 1 in 3 will have some sort of sexual element to it as well. And I remember when I was first starting out law school, it was a professor of mine who told me an extraordinary statistic that only 1 in 100 sexual assaults ever result in a conviction. So if you're a sexual assaulter, you can have 99 cracks at it, right? And the 100th time you'll actually be thrown in jail. So that tells you there is something really unhealthy with our own society. And this is our heritage of patriarchy. And it's only when you acknowledge the shared bullshit between the West and the East when it comes to our understanding of women, then we can have a conversation about what needs to happen in the Middle East and what needs to happen around the world. As a Pashtun, and the people who gave rise to the Taliban, their rule really was a hyper-Pashtun rule. A lot of people think the Taliban were a hyper-Islamic state. They weren't. There are elements of that, but they really were more hyper-Pashtun, where controlling the sheep and making sure nobody touched that extended to controlling the women. Your honor bound all of that up. Women became a means to men's honor. They became a means of propagating the next generation, of the whole system sustaining itself. So any woman that says, no, I'm not going to do what you asked me to do, I'm not going to marry that man, no, I'm not going to go through this. And if anybody from the outside comes in and says, hey, you can't treat women like that, what they're hearing is not this is a gender issue. They're hearing it as a fundamental attack on the very nature of society itself, which is an agnate system. Male line, What you find in the Kimberley is quite the opposite. In the Kimberley, it's through the maternal line that you trace yourself. And as hunter-gatherers, you don't really have strong notions of property. Turns out there's a lot more equity there. Not perfect, but there's a lot more equity there. So when we talk about gender, and changing and defending Eastern and Middle Eastern women, we always have to come at it from a universal angle. That the shadow that I see over there is just as dark here. And from that perspective, we don't sound like hypocrites. We become against all patriarchy, not just Eastern patriarchy, not just brown men. Yeah? Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Akram.